Hey, Coach Robert here. So we're going to learn another tactic in today's video. If you've watched the previous video, we've learned about forks, which are kind of fun. Forks win material. Forks where you attack two pieces with once and your opponent can only save one of them. We're going to learn another pointy object, I mean tactic. Today we're going to learn about pins. And now we're talking about when I say the word pin, I'm not saying pen that you write with or pin like a pig pen where you keep your pigs. I'm talking about like the little needle-like thing that you use to stick something to a board or to a wall, like a push pin, okay? So a pin in chess is where you have one of your pieces attacking a piece, but you're not really interested in trading because it might be an equal trade. But they don't want to move that piece out of the way because there's a more valuable piece behind it. And so if they move that piece out of the attack, you get a better piece. So as long as that pin exists, that piece that's being pinned, it's like it's not even on the board. It's not doing its job. It's not protecting anything. It's not attacking anything, because if it moves, you get something really good. Now there's two kinds of pins. There's an absolute pin where you are pinning something to a king. That means it's not even legal for them to take that piece and move it. So if you have pinned a knight to a king, that knight can't move. It's not allowed because that would leave their king in check. A relative pin is where you're just pinning something to a really valuable piece, like a queen or a rook. So they can move. It just means they lose their queen or their rook. And so we're going to look at some examples of pins, and we're going to use an opening that has lots of opportunities for pins that are really powerful, called the Stafford Gambit. Now this is a fun one that International Master Eric Rosen likes to play a lot. He's got a lot of videos on the Stafford Gambit. So I might link a couple of those into your description for this video. But we're going to take a look at this because it's a fun opening, and we're going to be able to learn about pins a little bit in it. So to start out with, this style of play starts with something called the Petrov defense. Now you may be familiar with this position, right? This is kind of normal, e4, e5, knight f3. And in most of the other openings we've looked at, we play knight c6. That leads into the Spanish or the Italian game. But if you play knight f6, that's the Petrov. Now you may say, okay, what's great about that? Well, you've hung your pawn, right? If you're playing with black, you've let white take the pawn on e5. If black captures the other pawn, then they're probably going to lose a knight because the queen's going to come out. And so it can be a little tricky to play this if you don't know what you're doing as black. So white takes the pawn normally, and the Stafford Gambit comes in when, instead of bringing the queen in to drive off the knight or a pawn to drive off the knight, something like that, black plays knight to c6. Okay, well, white's up a pawn. We could just trade material, right? At this point, white has traded material. It looks pretty good. But notice that right now, black is not doing too bad. You got lots of open lines for the bishop, right? And so it's not, the development for black is pretty good. And a computer is going to tell you white still has a pretty good advantage here, okay? So let's keep going and see what happens. So let's say white just does a normal developing move, getting ready to clear out that bishop on c1. The key thing for black is the move bishop c5. Black wants to get this bishop c5 in to have a line on the f pawn. All right, we've talked about before in some other videos why that f pawn is so weak. It's only protected by the king, and so putting some attacks on there are really important. Not only that, if the king castles, that king is going to be sitting over here on g1, and we're going to have a pin along this diagonal. The f pawn will be pinned to the king. That can really come in handy. So let's take a look at some examples of how play might continue. So maybe white goes ahead and develops the bishop, normal developing move, getting ready to castle. And black throws this pawn move out to get ready for some attacks. If white is smart, they're going to recognize that they've got to be careful. They don't want to walk into this pin here. If they do, they're losing some advantages here. So black wants to keep on with the attack of the king side. So might come up with this knight. All right, so again, it looks kind of scary. We've got two defenders on this knight. We've got the pawn and we've got the bishop. Whereas white only has two attackers, the bishop and the queen. All right, so that's not enough attackers. So white thinks maybe I should bring in another attacker with h3. But this gives black a really good opportunity to take advantage of that pin on f2 by bringing in the queen. You might say, well, how does that help? Doesn't that just drop the knight? Well, if white takes the knight with the pawn, then black is going to recapture and we're going to have an open line. So let's take a look at that. White captures the knight, black recaptures. Now, how is black getting out of getting mated here, right? Black is threatening checkmate in one move. So you could say, okay, well, maybe I'll toss this pawn out in front. Well, that doesn't do anything. You're just going to capture that. Well, how about I toss this pawn in front? Well, guess what? That's checkmate. You may think that, wait, can't I just capture the queen? Oh, but no, you can't, because the bishop would be then looking at the king. So this is what makes this so tricky, is we're so used to seeing this pawn be protected by the f pawn that when that f pawn is pinned, we forget that the g pawn is not protected anymore. So you might say, okay, well then, if instead of doing that, what if I just move the g pawn right away? Well, that g pawn still isn't protecting, right? It's not protected. So the queen is able to come in, check, and checkmate. Ouch. That is the danger of a pin. A pin makes a piece useless. It may have been doing a job in the past, but it's not doing it now. You may think it would be doing a job, but it can't be doing that job because it is stuck because of the pin. All right, let's take a look at another example. Again, we're looking at that Stafford Gambit that starts like this. So let's say white, instead of, allowing you to play that bishop c5 move, maybe they decide to chase your knight around. All right, so the knight comes into e4 and they just develop here. Well, this creates a really interesting opportunity as well. The queen can develop, and now, check it out. That f-pawn, serious weaknesses, right? We got the queen and the knight attacking the f-pawn, threatening checkmate. So, what do? Well, a natural looking move might be to play g3. Let's attack the queen. Block the queen's attack on f2 and attack the queen. Well, did you see a pin here? Take a second to see if you can find a pin. Why don't you pause the video, see if you can find a pin, and see if you can figure out black's continuation. Okay, did you find it? Hopefully you'll see that this pawn on h2 is pinned to the rook, right? Which means it's not protecting the g pawn at all. The f pawn is, but that's just going to leave everything wide open, right? Not only that, if white goes ahead and captures, if black goes ahead and captures that pawn, white can't recapture here. White has to recapture with the f pawn, but then it doesn't matter because black is still going to put you in check and attack the rook. And remember from the last video, that's called a fork. All right, and this becomes dangerous because that pawn on h2 is pinned to the rook, and so pushing that g pawn is not nearly as safe as you might think it is. Okay, so those are some examples of some pins. That second one was an example of a relative pin. What I want to show you next is what I call a false pin, where a piece looks pinned, but there's actually a counterattack, and if you take the piece that's pinned, it's bad for you. You may have seen the opening trap video where we cover the elephant trap, where we've seen that before. Well, there's something like that here in the Stafford Gambit too, that's even worse. All right, so getting back to familiar position with the Stafford. All right, let's say we've got that d3 move again. Remember, if you got d3, then you want to get that bishop c5 in, threatening to take on f2. So, take a look at this. White, instead of getting ready to castle, has decided to pin the knight, right? That knight can't move, right? Because you'll lose the queen. Well, this is what I call false pin, because black has too many threats that they can bring in if white decides to capture that queen. So let's take a look. The knight captures the pawn on e4. Okay. Well, if you take the queen, black has check and mate. Okay, so, well, that didn't work. That pin wasn't nearly as good as you thought it was. Well, okay, I don't have to take the queen right away, right? What if I got it. I'll take the knight, right? All right. Well, then black can just check the king. If the king takes the bishop, queen takes queen, and black is now up a queen. Okay. Well, what if I don't take the bishop? What if I got it, I'll step up. Well, then now you kind of have to take the bishop, and you still lose the queen. So, just because you have a pin doesn't mean it's a good pin. So always watch out for your opponent's counterattacks. Now, an absolute pin, that's usually pretty good because your opponent cannot move. Now, I was playing a game earlier today with one of my students, and I had pinned the king in two different directions. I had a rook pinning a pawn to the king and a queen pinning the pawn to the king. And so I used that as an opportunity to capture a pawn with the queen, and the queen couldn't be recaptured because the pawn that would recapture the queen was pinned by the rook. Well, after the king moved out of check, that pawn wasn't pinned anymore. So you have to be careful. Sometimes people move and the pin is no longer there. So you've got to be ready for that. But those pins are so powerful because they take a piece out of the game, at least for the time being, until they either relieve the pin or are able to drive your piece away. So use those pins to your advantage and keep your opponent locked down into place. And I will hopefully see you again soon in another video.